What happens when one of the sharpest comedians in the world sits down with a host who refuses to let anyone else have the last word in just 34 seconds? A casual conversation turned into one of the most explosive moments in talk show history, ending with a guest being thrown off set in front of millions of viewers. Ricky Gervais walked onto the set that night expecting a normal interview. He had done hundreds of these before. Talk about his comedy, share a few laughs, promote his latest project, and head home. Simple, easy. But what he got instead was something completely different. Something that would spiral out of control faster than anyone could have predicted. Piers Morgan sat across from him with that familiar smirk. The kind of look that said he was already planning his next interruption. The kind of look that made guests nervous before they even opened their mouths. But Ricky was not the type to get nervous. He had faced tougher crowds than this. He had hosted award shows where he roasted the most powerful people in entertainment. A talk show host was nothing. The interview started normally enough. Piers asked about Ricky's career, his comedy specials, his thoughts on cancel culture, standard questions. Ricky answered with his usual mix of honesty and humor. The audience laughed. Everything seemed fine. But then Piers started to push. He always did this. It was his style. Ask a question, then talk over the answer, make a statement, then act offended when someone disagreed. And tonight, he was in rare form. "You know what your problem is," Piers said, leaning forward with that condescending tone he loved to use. "You think you are smarter than everyone else in the room." Ricky laughed. Not a fake laugh, a genuine one. Because the irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Here was Piers Morgan, a man who interrupted his own guest to hear himself talk, accusing someone else of thinking they were the smartest person in the room. "That is rich coming from you," Ricky said, still smiling. "Mate, you have spent your entire career telling people what to think." The audience made that collective "oh" sound. The kind that happens when someone lands a good blow in a verbal sparring match. Piers did not like that. You could see it in his face. The way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes narrowed just a fraction. He was used to being the one who delivered the zingers, not the one receiving them. "I am a journalist," Piers shot back, his voice rising slightly. "I ask the tough questions. I hold people accountable. That is my job." "Right," Ricky said, nodding slowly. "And how did that work out at that tabloid you used to run, before all that phone hacking stuff came out?" The studio went quiet. Dead quiet. Because Ricky had just touched on something that Piers definitely did not want to talk about. Something that had followed him for years. Something that still made him uncomfortable whenever it came up. And Ricky knew it. He was not just swinging wildly. He was aiming for specific targets. Piers shifted in his seat. "We are not talking about that," he said quickly, trying to regain control of the conversation. "We are talking about you and your comedy." "No," Ricky said calmly. "You brought up credibility. You brought up holding people accountable. So, let us talk about it. Let us talk about the journalists who hacked phones and invaded people's privacy. Let us talk about that." "That has nothing to do with this interview," Piers said, his voice getting louder now. He was flustered. Anyone watching could see it. The confident host who always had a comeback was scrambling. "It has everything to do with this interview," Ricky replied. "You are sitting here acting like you are some moral authority, but your own past is questionable at best. You want to judge everyone else, but you cannot handle being judged yourself." The audience was completely silent now. This had gone from a playful back and forth to something much more intense, much more real. Piers was gripping the armrest of his chair. His face was turning red. You could practically see the steam coming out of his ears. "You do not know what you are talking about," Piers said through gritted teeth. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Ricky said. "And so does everyone watching. That is what bothers you. Not that I'm saying it, but that everyone knows it is true." Piers stood up suddenly. The movement was so abrupt that it startled everyone in the studio. He pointed at Ricky, his fingers shaking slightly. "I will not sit here and be disrespected on my own show," he said, his voice booming now by you or anyone else. Ricky stayed seated, calm, unfazed. He looked up at Piers with an expression that was almost pitying. "Mate," he said softly. "I have not disrespected you. I have just refused to pretend that you are something you are not. There is a difference." That was it. That was the moment, the exact second where Piers Morgan completely lost control. He turned to someone off camera and made a gesture, a sharp, angry gesture. Within seconds, two producers rushed onto the set. They looked confused, glancing between Piers and Ricky, not quite sure what was happening. "Get him out of here," Piers said, his voice shaking with rage. "Get him off my set now," the producers hesitated. You could see it on their faces. This was live television. Millions of people were watching. Throwing a guest off the show mid-in was not something that happened ever, but Piers was not backing down. I said, "Get him out," he shouted. Ricky stood up slowly, brushing off his jacket. He did not look angry. He did not look upset. If anything, he looked amused, like this was exactly what he expected to happen, like Piers had just proven every single point he had been making. "Well," Ricky said, looking directly at the camera. "I guess we know who the real snowflake is, do we not?" The audience erupted. Some people were laughing. Others were gasping, a few were even applauding. It was chaos. Pure unfiltered chaos. And Piers Morgan was standing in the middle of it, red-faced and furious, watching as his show fell apart around him. "Ouch!" he screamed again, pointing toward the exit. Ricky started walking toward the side of the stage, but he was taking his time, strolling, really like he was out for a casual walk in the park. The producers were beside him, not quite sure if they should be escorting him or just following along. The whole thing looked absurd. As he reached the edge of the stage, Ricky turned back one last time. "Thanks for having me, Piers," he called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "This has been absolutely delightful." And then he was gone, off the stage, out of the studio, leaving Piers Morgan standing there alone, trying desperately to compose himself in front of a live audience and millions of viewers at home. Piers walked back to his chair and sat down heavily. He ran a hand through his hair, took a deep breath, and looked into the camera. You could see him trying to gather his thoughts, trying to figure out what to say next, trying to salvage something from the wreckage of what had just happened. "Well," he finally said, his voice still shaking. "That was unfortunate. Ricky Gervais, ladies and gentlemen, a man who clearly cannot handle a real conversation, but nobody was buying it. The audience was not buying it. The viewers at home were not buying it because everyone had just watched the same thing unfold. Everyone had seen who lost control, who started shouting, who threw someone off their show because they could not handle being challenged." Piers tried to move on. He introduced the next segment talking about some celebrity gossip story that nobody cared about. But the energy was gone. The show was dead. He was just going through the motions now, counting down the minutes until he could get off the air. But let us rewind a bit. Let us go back to the beginning of this interview because the warning signs were there from the start. You could see this coming if you knew where to look. When Ricky first walked out, Piers greeted him with what seemed like warmth. Handshakes, smiles, the usual pleasantries. But there was something off about it, something forced. Like Piers was already on edge before the conversation even started. Maybe he knew Ricky would not be an easy interview. Maybe he had heard stories from other hosts. Or maybe he just did not like that Ricky was funnier than him, sharper than him, more respected than him. Whatever the reason, Piers came into this interview with something to prove. And that is always dangerous because when you have something to prove, you stop listening. You stop having a real conversation. You just wait for your chance to dominate, to win, to make sure everyone knows you are in charge. The first few questions were safe. Softballs. Ricky answered them easily, throwing in jokes that made the audience laugh. Piers laughed too, but it was that host laugh, the one that is more about filling time than genuine amusement. You have seen it 1,000 times, that quick haha before moving on to the next question. "So tell me," Piers said, settling back in his chair. "Do you ever worry that your comedy goes too far, that maybe you cross lines that should not be crossed?" It was a loaded question, the kind designed to put Ricky on the defensive, to make him explain himself, to justify his art to someone who had already decided it was offensive. Ricky recognized it immediately. He had been asked versions of this question hundreds of times before. "No," he said simply. "I do not worry about that at all." Piers raised his eyebrows, clearly expecting more, waiting for Ricky to elaborate, to fill the silence. But Ricky just sat there comfortable in the pause, letting Piers squirm. "That is it," Piers finally said. "Just know what else do you want me to say?" Ricky asked. "You asked if I worry about it?" "I do not. I think about it. Sure. I am thoughtful about my comedy, but worry no. Because I know where my line is. I know what I'm trying to say. And if other people do not get it, that is their problem, not mine." "But do you not have a responsibility?" Piers pressed. "As someone with a platform, as someone with influence, a responsibility to whom?" Ricky shot back. "To you, to people who are never going to find me funny anyway. My responsibility is to be honest, to say what I actually think, not to make everyone comfortable. So, you do not care if you offend people." "I did not say that. I said I do not worry about crossing lines. Those are two different things. Of course, I care about people's feelings. I'm not a psychopath. But I also refuse to let the most sensitive person in the room decide what everyone else is allowed to laugh at. Piers leaned forward, sensing an opening. But who decides what is okay to joke about? Who gets to make that call? The person telling the joke, Ricky said without hesitation. That is how comedy works. That is how free speech works. You say something, people react, and then we all move on with our lives. Nobody dies. Nobody goes to prison. We just continue existing. But some things should not be joked about, Piers insisted, his voice taking on that righteous tone. Some topics are too serious, too painful, too important. According to whom? Ricky asked. According to you. See, that is the problem with your whole argument. You want to be the arbiter of what is acceptable. You want to decide where the line is, but you do not get to do that. Nobody does. That is not how this works. The audience started clapping. Not everyone, but enough that it was noticeable. Enough that Piers definitely heard it, and that bothered him. You could see it. The slight twitch in his jaw, the way he glanced toward the crowd with barely concealed annoyance. I am not trying to be an arbiter of anything, Piers said defensively. I am just saying that there are things that most reasonable people would agree are off limits. Name one, Ricky challenged. Piers paused. He had not expected to be put on the spot like this. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The silence stretched out for several uncomfortable seconds. Well, he finally said, I think we can all agree that mocking someone's disability is cruel and unnecessary. Sure, Ricky agreed. If you are actually mocking someone's disability to hurt them, that is cruel. But what if you are making a joke about society's reaction to disability? What if you are challenging people's assumptions? What if you were using humor to make a larger point about discrimination and prejudice? Is that still off limits? It depends on how you do it, Piers said, trying to regain his footing. Exactly, Ricky said, pointing at him. It depends on context, on intention, on execution, which means there are no hard and fast rules, which means you cannot just draw a line and say nothing on this side is acceptable. Comedy is nuanced. It is complicated. And people like you want to make it simple because simple is easier to control. People like me, Piers repeated, his voice rising. What is that supposed to mean? People who think they should be in charge of what everyone else thinks and says and does, Ricky explained. People who cannot stand the idea that someone might have a different opinion. People who dress up their desire for control as concern for others. That was when Piers first stood up from his chair. Not the final time. This was earlier, before things got truly heated. He stood up and started pacing like he could not contain his frustration sitting down. I find it fascinating, Piers said, his voice dripping with condescension. That you of all people are lecturing me about control. You who throws a tantrum whenever anyone criticizes your work. You who blocks people on social media for disagreeing with you. You want to talk about not being able to handle different opinions. Ricky laughed again. That same genuine laugh, because Piers had just walked right into another trap. Mate, Ricky said, blocking someone on Twitter is not the same as trying to get them fired or trying to silence them or trying to stop them from working. I am allowed to curate my own social media experience. That is not censorship. That is just not wanting to hear from idiots all day. There is a difference. So, anyone who criticizes you is an idiot? Piers asked, thinking he had caught Ricky in a contradiction. No, Ricky said patiently, like he was explaining something to a child. People who criticize me thoughtfully and intelligently are fine. I can handle that. I welcome that. But people who just hurl insults or make bad faith arguments or deliberately misrepresent what I said. Yeah, I do not need that in my life. And neither do you, by the way. I have seen your Twitter feed. You block people all the time. That is different. Piers protested. How? Ricky asked. How is it different when you do it? Piers did not have an answer for that. He just stood there, mouth slightly open, caught in his own hypocrisy. The audience could sense it, too. They were fully on Ricky's side. Now, every time he made a point, there were nods and murmurs of agreement. And that is when Piers made his fatal mistake. The moment where he could have laughed it off, admitted he was being a bit hypocritical, and moved on. The moment where he could have salvaged the interview and his dignity, but instead he doubled down. The difference, Piers said slowly, his voice hard, is that I actually matter. I am a real journalist. I have broken major stories. I have interviewed world leaders. You are just a comedian. Someone who tells jokes for a living. So when I block someone, it is because I do not have time for nonsense. When you block someone, it is because you cannot handle criticism. The studio went absolutely silent because what Piers had just said was so arrogant, so dismissive, so blatantly disrespectful that even his own audience was stunned. You could have heard a pin drop. Nobody moved, Nobody breathed. Ricky sat there for a long moment just looking at Piers. His expression was unreadable. And then slowly a smile spread across his face. Not a friendly smile, a smile that said, "Game over. You just lost." "You think you are better than me," Ricky said quietly. It was not a question. It was a statement. "You genuinely believe that what you do is more important than what I do? That journalism or whatever you want to call what you do is somehow more valuable than comedy?" "It is," Piers said flatly. "Comedy is entertainment. Journalism is truth." "Truth?" Ricky repeated, his voice incredulous. "You want to talk about truth? Let us talk about all the times you have been wrong. All the times you have printed stories that were not true. All the times you have had to retract things or apologize or quietly edit articles. You act like you are some guardian of truth, but your track record is spotty at best." "Everyone makes mistakes," Piers said defensively. "Right. Everyone makes mistakes, including comedians. But when I make a mistake, I just told a bad joke. When you make a mistake, you ruin someone's life. You print lies. You destroy reputations. So maybe get off your high horse before you lecture me about the importance of what you do." Piers was shaking now, actually shaking with anger. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. His face was bright red. He looked like he might explode at any second. "How dare you?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "How dare you come on my show and speak to me like this? How dare I?" Ricky said, standing up now, too. They were face to face, separated only by the coffee table between them. "You are the one who invited me here. You are the one who started throwing insults. You are the one who said I do not matter, so do not act surprised when I push back. This is my show," Piers practically growled. "Mine, and I will not be disrespected in front of my own audience." "Then maybe you should not disrespect your guests," Ricky said calmly. "Maybe you should treat people with the same respect you expect from them." Wild concept, I know. And that was when Piers completely snapped. When he called for the producers, when he demanded that Ricky be removed from the set, when everything fell apart in spectacular fashion. As the producers approached, Ricky turned to the audience one more time. "You all saw this, right?" he said, gesturing at Piers. "You all saw what just happened." He could not handle a conversation. He could not handle being challenged. "So, he is throwing me out. Remember that the next time he acts like he is some champion of free speech. Remember that he only supports free speech when people agree with him. Get out." Piers screamed, his voice cracking slightly. And Ricky did. He walked off that stage with his head held high. While Piers Morgan stood there in the ruins of his own making, having just proven every single point his guest had made about him. The camera stayed on Piers for a few seconds after Ricky left. And in those few seconds, you could see everything. The anger, the embarrassment, the realization that he had just made a massive mistake in front of millions of people. He tried to compose himself, tried to put on that confident host persona again, but it was too late. Everyone had seen behind the mask. Everyone knew what kind of person he really was when things did not go his way. This was not an interview anymore. It was not even a debate. It was a complete and total meltdown. And the worst part for Piers was that it was entirely his own fault. He let his ego get the better of him. He let his need to be right, to be important, to be respected, override his common sense. And in doing so, he handed Ricky Gervais the greatest victory possible. He made him look reasonable, calm, and collected while he himself looked like a petulant child throwing a tantrum. The remaining minutes of the show were painful to watch. Piers tried to continue, tried to pretend nothing unusual had happened, but the energy was gone. His co-host looked uncomfortable. The audience was restless and viewers at home were already taking to social media to share their thoughts on what they had just witnessed, because that is the thing about moments like this. They take on a life of their own, they spread. They get analyzed and debated and memed. They become part of the cultural conversation, and no matter what Piers Morgan said or did after this, no matter how he tried to spin it or justify it, this moment would follow him. This moment would define him. He had walked into this interview thinking he would expose Ricky Gervais as an arrogant comedian who could not handle real questions. Instead, he exposed himself as exactly what Ricky had accused him of being all along. A bully who only liked free speech when he controlled the conversation. A hypocrite who demanded respect while giving none. An entitled host who would rather throw a guest off his show than admit he might be wrong about something. And Ricky walked out of that studio and straight into legend, because standing up to bullies, especially bullies with power and platforms, always resonates with people. Always feels like justice. Always feels like someone finally said what everyone else was thinking. That is what makes this moment so memorable. Not just that someone got kicked off a talk show. That has happened before. But the way it happened, The fact that the host so thoroughly proved his guest point by losing control. The fact that millions of people watched in real time as someone's ego destroyed them. Piers Morgan wanted to be the star of this interview. He wanted to be the one everyone talked about afterward. And he got his wish, just not in the way he hoped.